My name is Matt Skinner. I serve as the Scholar for Adult Education at Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis. This is a new installment of our series during summer 2020 called Big Questions for a Changing Church. Both the COVID-19 pandemic as well as a renewed imperative to confront systemic racism in America are changing how we perceive God, how we perceive the church, and how we perceive our work in the world. And so in this series weekly, I'm visiting with a different theological thinker who will share their perspectives on ways that congregations can change creatively, think differently, nourish themselves spiritually, and also accompany our neighbors more generously. Today, I'm very glad to be joined by Reverend Dr. Jean-Pierre Ruiz, who is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at St. John's University in New York. There he is also a Senior Research Fellow at the university's Vincentian Center for Church and Society. He is a prolific author. Two books to highlight are Reading from the Edges, The Bible and People on the Move, and then also The Word of God and Latino Catholics, The Teachings of the Road to Emmaus. He is involved in a variety of societies and journals and groups in the world of biblical studies and their intersection with the church. Most notable, he was a former president, or is a former president, of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States. There's a lot. We could go on and on, Jean-Pierre, but I'll leave it at that and say welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Well, I'm happy to learn from you and to get your insights on the table before the people at Westminster Presbyterian and others who might stumble across our recording. Maybe we can start with your expertise as a biblical scholar. I know you've done a lot of work on the book of Revelation, which is not everybody's favorite New Testament writing, but a fascinating writing. And that must lead you to think about ways in which God is revealed in human experience, or ways in which we obscure God, or God becomes obscured in our experience or our politics or our society, both in the first century, but also now. So my question is there anything revelatory about our current circumstances right now? Should our eyes be attuned to things that we otherwise have missed or would miss if we're not paying attention?
Oh gosh, yes. When people discover that I'm interested in the book of Revelation, it tends to have one of two fairly extreme reactions in two different directions. People will either politely start to back away from me because of that interest in the book that's at the end of the New Testament canon that tends to make people really, really uncomfortable. Or else people start to engage me in conversation about whether I know anything that's privileged information or whether I have any insights into the secrets of the end of the world. Neither of those is an especially productive stance with respect to the book of Revelation, either in its first century background or in the way in which it's read by people today, including the ways in which it's read by the churches. I mean, the book itself means disclosure. The book itself means disclosure, and it's disclosure around issues of imminent moment for people who perceive themselves to be marginalized, minoritized, and in crisis. And the crisis that they were facing at the end of the first century had to do with the crisis of identity over against the overwhelming presence politically, commercially, socially, aesthetically, religiously of the Roman Empire, even in its far-flung provinces. And we're talking about present-day Turkey, the Roman province of Asia, where Rome made its presence very, very visibly felt, and where members of the Jesus movement were a very, very small minority. Probably not persecuted actively, but they certainly knew that they didn't have access to the material resources, economically or politically, or to the literary resources or to the stories with which the Roman Empire supported and sustained itself and advanced its own political and economic agendas. For that reason, the Book of Revelation has become very popular among minoritized and marginalized communities around the world. It was a favorite, for example, of liberation theologians in Latin America. It was a favorite, for example, in apartheid-era South Africa. And it continues to be a book that invites people to think about themselves in terms of a system that puts them at risk, a system that marginalizes them, a system that minoritizes them, and reveals to them an alternate way of thinking and reveals to them an alternate way of being, where in fact they can understand themselves not as history's losers, but paradoxically as those about whom God really and genuinely cares, so that ultimately there is hope even in the midst of despair. So people ask me, are we living in apocalyptic times? I would venture to say that there is no time that has ever failed to be apocalyptic in the sense of a time that is open to divine self-disclosure, open to new ways of thinking, open to new ways of being in the light of religious commitment, in the light of faith, in this world as it is. I would even venture to say that while some regard the apocalypse as escapist and fantasy literature, and while there are post-apocalyptic books of fiction and film and so on, the apocalypse is really about what's really real, and to recognize what it reveals about ourselves, what it reveals about the world, what it reveals about the purpose of things, is a matter of being attentive to the everyday.
What are some of those really real things? Are they all negative? Like imperial systems have gluttonous appetites or are evil? Are there images of beauty that you find in the book as well, or holiness or hope that capture your attention?
Well, for instance, I'm a city kid, born and raised in New York City.
You don't look like it from your background, I'm just saying.
Well, my background is my happy place. It's the view from an apartment that I've had the pleasure of staying in Puerto Rico. My heritage is Puerto Rican, but I'm a New Yorican, which means I was born and raised in the Puerto Rican diaspora of New York City. And aside from my seminary studies and my graduate studies in Rome, the city that the Book of Revelation calls Babylon the Great, I've lived in New York for much of my life. So as a city kid, the urban reality of the apocalypse is something that appeals to me. So that the apocalypse's vision of what it's like when human beings form a successful community that's in communion with God is a city. It's the Jerusalem sent of God, the Jerusalem from above, which is a place of harmony, which is a place of cooperation, which is a place of non-exploitation, which is a place where people's dignity is recognized for what it is. It's a place of non-violence, it's a place of non-competitiveness, and it's a city.
Yeah. Has that shaped your perspective on the Bible as a whole? Your work with Revelation, has that?
I think it's substantially affected the way that I read a good bit of the Bible. Way back when I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the way in which material from the book of the prophet Ezekiel helps to shape the imagery and the symbolism of the book of Revelation. And the book of Ezekiel, likewise, is an urban book, which looks wistfully back on Jerusalem from the standpoint of exile, asking questions about why the calamity that befell Jerusalem took place, and looking forward to a point where the eschatological Jerusalem will be not just a restoration, will be not just a new normal, but a different sphere of reality, a different way of being, community, and a different way of being in communion with the divine. So Jerusalem, the earthly Jerusalem, with all of its complications, fascinates and captivates me, and the ways in which the biblical texts depict Jerusalem as a place that's desired, as a place that's idealized, as a place that's also very conflicted, also appeals to me.
Maybe that's a good transition to some of your other work too, which has been about interpreting scripture with through the eyes of immigration and the experiences of immigrants. You've written quite a bit about that, and asked readers to maybe reassess their views of certain biblical texts to take that into account, and immigration is, of course, not just an urban phenomenon, but sometimes rural. And the Bible is full of migratory moments, some chosen and many not. Can you say a little more about that, about how that perspective you think is important for congregations to think about as they read scripture together?
Sure. First, a little autobiographical story. I got into my doctoral studies in Bible after several years of parish ministry in an inner city parish called Our Lady of Loreto in the Brownsville, East New York section of Brooklyn. And for the last several years, I've driven to and from the campus of my university down the street where that church was located. And for the last couple of years, I got to watch as that structure was demolished. It was a church that was built at the beginning of the 20th century, built by and for immigrants from southern Italy, as so many churches in the Diocese of Brooklyn were. And while I was there, in the 3 years and change that I was there, I got involved in all sorts of what John Lewis would call good trouble, working with the wonderful people of East Brooklyn congregations around issues principally of the school boards and the quality or lack thereof of public education in that area. At the end of 3 years, I was invited to pursue further studies, doctoral studies in Bible, and I have to admit that I felt a little bit guilty leaving the place. I formed friendships, and some of the friendships that I formed there are still some of my strongest friendships, but I went into my doctoral studies with my feet still on the ground of Brooklyn, and aside from the incredible esoterica of doing doctoral studies in Bible, my heart never really left that place. And so I find that the longer I engage in biblical studies, the more the questions I ask are questions that don't come from idle curiosity around this reading or that reading of a particular manuscript tradition, but questions that come from having my feet planted in that very specific set of circumstances as a reader. A former bishop of this diocese, it's the smallest territorial diocese in the United States. It's just 2 counties, Kings and Queens, 2 counties of New York City. Still has close to, I don't know what the numbers are these days, but somewhere in the area of 1.8 million Roman Catholics. And the former bishop of this diocese, Tom Daly, used to say, "The world is here." This is a diocese and has always been a diocese of immigrants. And Brooklyn is called the borough of churches because as each immigrant group came, they built their own churches as the focal points of their life as a community, and to make meaning in this new and strange place of theirs. I love to remember the story of how when one of the parishioners was doing some restoration work and some painting inside of the Church of Our Lady of Loreto, some of the plaster crumbled from one of the fake marble columns, and inside was some of the fill that had been used by the workers who did the original work. And the fill happened to include pages still legible of an Italian immigrant newspaper from that time. I like to think, and I think it would be right on target to think that people are still building church in places like Brooklyn and Queens. People are still building church across the urban centers of the United States. And the immigrant experience has continued to shape and reshape that reality. So to talk church, to talk about being a Christian in New York City and so many other places across the United States is to be immersed in the reality of a history of immigration and a present reality that's shaped by the ongoing challenges of immigration. So that has shaped my work in biblical studies and my writing. And it's not only a US concern. A little more than a year ago, I had the pleasure of being in Buenos Aires with a colleague from Wheaton College, Professor Danny Carroll, and we co-facilitated a seminar on the Bible and immigration at an international conference of Latin American biblical scholars. We had biblical scholars from more than 25 countries, and we were happily surprised at the interest in immigration and on the ways in which immigration was affecting the people who came to our seminar session. It's a hemispheric reality. It's a global reality that needs to be reckoned with, not just in the study of the Bible, but in terms of pursuing justice and recognizing the dignity of people who are on the move.
I wonder if we can expand that a bit in terms of talking about hospitality and how that appears in the pages of Scripture as such an important theme. Some of that, of course, is cultural in terms of what life was like in biblical times, but it's a theological theme too, as well, isn't it? In terms of the hospitality of God and the hospitality of the community of faith. I'm wondering how that term sits with you, given your experience in that parish and also even still in St. John's, which is a incredibly diverse university, if my memory is correct.
Sure. The word that you chose, hospitality, is actually, if I have to be completely honest, is a word that makes me more than a little bit uncomfortable. And the reason for which it makes me uncomfortable is that it reflects a power differential between the one who is able to show hospitality and those to whom hospitality is shown. So it puts power in the hands of the host, power in the hands of the one or the ones who are already here, who have the choice to be hospitable or not to those who are more recently arrived. I think that the negotiation needs to be reframed and restated in different sorts of terms than the power language of hospitality. So that's with respect to the word itself. What some colleagues have taken to doing in settings like this one and in others, for example, is asking us to name the lands where we happen to be in terms of the first peoples who were here before us. So, for example, here in central Brooklyn, in the place where I'm literally sitting right now, I'm sitting on land that was once the homeland of the Canarsie band of the Lenape people. who were displaced by the Dutch settlers to Brooklyn. Brooklyn is a Dutch name, and the neighborhood where I am in Brooklyn, Prospect Lefferts Gardens, reflects the name of the Lefferts family, whose lands displaced the Canarsie band of Lenape, the Lenape nation, from this place. So as we look at where we happen to be, unless we are First Peoples, unless we're indigenous persons, we all came here from somewhere. And those stories are complicated and conflicted and are matters of negotiations between powerful and less powerful and disempowered peoples. So that, for instance, when we look at the stories of Israel's entry into the land, those too are very, very complicated stories, described in very, very conflictual terms in the Bible, but very often matters of complex negotiation among people who were there before, and of renegotiating those relationships in the light of present reality. There's a lot to learn, both positively and negatively, from the ways in which those relationships were negotiated in terms of mutual respect, the mutual respect that's due different peoples from different places of origin and with different stories. And that's one of the many things that the Bible teaches us to do. And there are characters in the Bible who maneuver and negotiate around a number of different identities. Take Joseph in the book of Genesis. Joseph is a victim of human trafficking. He's a victim of human trafficking who's sold, winds up in Egypt as a result of being sold, and yet he's someone who makes out for himself. He becomes extremely powerful. He passes for an Egyptian to the extent that even his own brothers no longer recognize him. So this is a matter of negotiating identities, and not just as a matter of passing, not just as a matter of assimilating, but of retaining his own identity. Joseph never really becomes an Egyptian. He names his children who are born in Egypt. He gives them Hebrew names. He prays to the Hebrews' God. And ultimately he negotiates the survival of his own family in their movement as environmental migrants because of the famine that they were suffering. He makes it possible for them to survive and to thrive in a land that's not their own.
Can I ask for clarification on that? What does it mean that he doesn't become Egyptian? I mean, obviously the text doesn't spend time working that question over, but would it have been possible for him to be an Egyptian who still worships the God of Israel and who still perhaps speaks Hebrew or gives his children Hebrew names? Or
it sure could, but the text is very clear. You know, for instance, the text is very clear that he continues to be understood as and continues to be recognized as a Hebrew by the Egyptians. Particularly in the scene where he's accused of misbehaving. The accusation is made that it's this Hebrew, this foreigner, who's responsible for doing this.
Is that a shortcoming on the Egyptians' part then, that they refuse to grant that identity to him?
Well, yes and no. It's an identity that he cherishes with what's been called dual consciousness, and we find, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, we're told that a Pharaoh came to power who knew Joseph not, and who feels threatened by the increasing numbers of the Hebrew people, and acts not only xenophobically, but whose behavior takes the turn that often occurs from xenophobia to genocide. To genocide in having the sons that are born to Hebrews killed. Now, genocide takes place in all sorts of more subtle ways in the present day by any other name, so that even as we wrestle with the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, we find that there are refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers who continue to be detained at the US border, among them children who continue to be held in cages, and detainees who are disproportionately subject to infection by the COVID-19 virus. So this is going on under our noses, so to speak, even as the entire nation, even as the entire world wrestles with the challenges of COVID-19. The other injustices haven't disappeared.
Right. Our exposure to them might have been covered in some ways, and maybe our sense of powerlessness in response to them is part of that as well. But of course, they've not disappeared. I wonder about the question of, to me, what I'm fascinated in what you're talking about is it has to do with questions of identity and retaining a sense of one's own identity, and that flexibility or that mobility that allows somebody like Joseph to have a multiple consciousness, and how that definition works. Of course, that also matters on bigger communal levels as well. So in this country, there's a conversation about statues and what statues should be removed or what places need to be renamed. We, of course, have that quite a bit here in Minnesota as well, largely around indigenous peoples and names and certain figures that are celebrated. And those things are political questions on one level, but they also are questions about values, and they're questions about how does a society tell its story? In telling our story, how do we know who we are? Who are we together? Whose stories are we going to refuse to tell, or are we going to cover up? I wonder if you have insight into that in terms of how might congregations or how might churches be engaged in those roles. Churches, of course, have their own histories that we sometimes cover up or need to reckon with, but how might the church be engaged in those conversations about communal history, or a just way of telling a society's story that's both, that's honest?
That's a wonderful question, and it's one that I've thought about quite a bit over the last several months. The question that I ask myself when I read history, when I listen to history, when I see the ways in which history is constructed, and I'll get back to that, is who stands to gain and who stands to lose from the way in which this particular story has been told. If history is a matter of the presentation of winners versus losers, it's my inclination to believe that the story is being much oversimplified from what actually went down, what actually took place. So that when we enshrine a particular version of a story by building a statue, by erecting a statue in a public place, who stands to gain from that statue, and whose stories are being eclipsed? To whom is violence being done by the way in which this story is being told? And we've seen any number of different statues being toppled. If we go back not too terribly long, we see how lots of people cheered, for instance, when monumental statues of Saddam Hussein were toppled in Iraq, or with the collapse of the totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe. People applauded vigorously when they saw images that represented the oppressiveness of those regimes being toppled. Well, when I ask myself what's the difference, I have to remind myself that history is not something that's fixed in stone, in bronze, or in marble. History is fluid and is being made and remade at every moment and even as we speak. And the opportunity that retelling history provides is an opportunity to recover suppressed stories, to recover lost stories, to raise up those whose stories have been violently marginalized and suppressed, and to allow more voices to speak than have been heard in the public forum. So I see this not simply as a matter of iconoclasm simply understood, but as a radical rethinking of the way in which we tell and retell and reconstruct history. Because if history is not something fixed, but rather fluid as a matter of the stories that we tell each other to live by, in terms of things that we want to repeat, in terms of values by which we want to live, and in terms of misdeeds that we hope never to repeat, this is a matter of the dynamism of history. So I see this as a healthy moment from which some important insights can be gained, particularly insofar as this is a grassroots movement. This is not a top-down kind of movement, but this is real people, this is ordinary people, this is all sorts of people challenging fixed ways of understanding the past of this nation and the figures who have been promoted in these bronze and marble and so on statues, many of which are being toppled. I'm okay with that.
Your attention to the fact that it's grassroots, I think, is really important, that this is coming from not just a voice, many voices in the culture that might strike some people as a surprise, or where have these voices been? And so one of the criticisms is, well, these are just anarchists, right, who don't really care about anything. But of course, behind all of this is not just frustration, but also real thoughtful ways of critiquing the stories, right? The established stories. Maybe also one of the really important or interesting conversations will be, with what will we replace them with? Not to say that because you tear a statue down, you have to build a new statue, but how will we rename? How will we rethink the public square in terms of our symbols, our memorials? And I just find that interesting, especially as a being part of a congregation that sits downtown in a city with a lot of symbols, some deliberately placed there, others not deliberately placed there, right? On ways in which neighborhoods change and freeways break things up. But what does it mean to try to rewrite some of those stories in a just way? Seems to me a conversation that churches need to be engaged in, or at least willing to participate in.
Sure. I should also note that this business about toppling statues is nothing new. The Romans were really good at this with what happened with the damnatio memoriae. When an emperor fell out of fashion, images of that emperor were obliterated. Statues that depicted that emperor were toppled or else repurposed by being renamed. So this is no longer the Emperor Domitian in this equestrian statue. Now we'll call it the Emperor Nerva. So this business about the impermanence of even monuments that are made with materials that speak permanence, bronze and stone and so on, is really nothing new, so that people have been reshaping and retelling and remaking history for as long as people have been telling stories of how things happened and why it matters. And that's particularly important for the churches, because if the churches are to maintain a prophetic edge, the prophet has long been the kind of person who nags people about the status quo, who asks the hard why question about something that we might be inclined to say, well, it's always been this way. Well, why has it been this way? Must it continue to be this way? Who profits from the way things are in terms of the present status quo? And what might be different if we reimagined, if we re-envisioned things differently? So in that sense, we learn from prophets who are visionaries of the possible and really critics of the established order.
Right. I appreciate that clarification. I want to take us in a slightly different direction here.
Sure.
In light of the time that we have. Previous installments in this video series, I've talked to scholars who are either Presbyterian themselves or who work at Presbyterian institutions or close to that. Kind of making a move here toward the end of the summer, I'm really curious, and hopefully you can help widen some of our conversations at Westminster around how we maintain community, how we remain an open and inclusive, welcoming community, how we also engage in struggles for justice in light of the pandemic, in light of things. But I'm curious about your perspective as a Roman Catholic in terms of what do you see are some of the gifts from your own church, your own tradition, that could be instructive to other people of faith, to other Christians trying to navigate what's a very, very new world in terms of the pandemic for all of us, but also a time of struggle. Are there things in your tradition, in your history that you find really helpful that could be gifts to the broader church?
Oh, absolutely. July 31st in the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar was the memorial of Saint Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius Loyola was a fascinating figure in many ways, who certainly didn't start out wanting to become a saint, who started out wanting to be a knight when a cannonball shattered his leg and shattered that ambition. During his convalescence, he read the books that happened to be available that included the lives of the saints. And so he decided that for the rest of his life, he wanted to be like Saint Dominic. He decided that he wanted to be like Saint Francis of Assisi, renowned for different reasons than his initial ambitions had motivated him. Ignatius's great insight and his great gift to the church, not just the Jesuit order, not just to the Catholic Church, but Ignatius's great insight is seeing God in all things, seeing God in all things. And this gift leads to what I like to call a very incarnational spirituality. And that jives very well with the Latinekis approach to faith and religious practice, because in Latinekis communities, not just recent immigrants, but those who have been here well before the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established, because the Spanish colonization of Florida, the Spanish colonization of the U.S. Southwest happened much earlier, is an attention to lived daily experience and to an awareness of and a practice of the presence of the divine, and an awareness of the presence of grace and its opposite number of sin in lived daily experience. So what Ignatius is doing, and what Latinekis popular religion is doing, is tapping into something that is profoundly big C Catholic and also little c Catholic. And the big C Catholic is what the late sociologist and very successful novelist Andrew Greeley called the sacramental imagination. So it's a matter of taking bread and taking wine and sanctifying it, or allowing God to sanctify those elements of lived daily experience. It's of oil and water and day-to-day conversation and lived shared experience among ordinary folk that can be openings to the reality of the presence of God, openings to the reality of grace in people's lives. Well, if God can be seen, if God can be sought, if God can be found in all things, then there is no place and there is no circumstance where God can be said to be absent, even pandemics, even pandemics. So where is God during this terrible, terrible moment? A few months ago, when New York City was at the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, not more than a minute would pass when we would hear ambulances bringing people to the hospitals that are in the area where I live. So where was God? Where is God? God is with those paramedics. God was present in those patient care people. God was with those emergency room physicians and physicians' assistants and nurses and maintenance staff. God was in those otherwise ordinary people who, by doing what they did, by caring for people who were stricken with COVID-19 and with the other things that continued to afflict people even in the midst of the pandemic, there was the presence of God. There is the presence of God. So the Ignatian intuition of finding God in all things, the Catholic notion of a sacramental imagination, of being able to see God present and to see God at work in ordinary lived experience, not just within the walls of the churches, not just in religious rituals, I think is an insight and an asset that Catholics bring to not only to other Christians, but to other people of whatever faith.
Can you describe that Ignatian intuition a little more, especially regarding community versus individuals? I can imagine that's something that some people might experience as either easy to do on their own and then harder to do in community because somebody else's intuition of God's presence might not match mine. And for others, it might be really hard to do alone, but easier in a community. Is there a play between the sole person and a group?
There is a sense in which seeing God in all things, which is the Ignatian intuition, works within the church as a community of very, very different people. We're not talking about everybody wearing the same uniform. We're not talking about a standardization of practice or of even of style, but seeing God in all things is a challenge to see God in people who are other than myself, in people who believe differently than I do, even people with whose beliefs and practices I happen to be in conflict. So that the challenge is to somehow recognize that God is at work in the person with whom I vehemently agree over politics, with the person with whom I vehemently agree over various economic practices, and so on. And that's the ethical challenge that's at work, to push the values that are at stake, certainly, but to recognize the dignity of even the person with whom I might be in profound disagreement, and to recognize not only the likelihood, but the reality that God is at work in that person too. So it means that community is not just a matter of a club of the like-minded. It's a matter of recognizing our deep connectedness even to people who wouldn't want to associate with us, people who wouldn't be seen walking side by side with us down the street.
Thank you for opening that up. I'm glad to hear that. I've learned things about Ignatius that, believe it or not, I was never taught in my Presbyterian seminary. One more question for you, and then I'll let you go.
Sure.
You primarily teach undergraduates, some graduates, right? But you teach religion, you teach Christianity and Christian scriptures.
I do.
Are there things you'll be telling them this fall that you weren't telling them 6 months ago about why their study of religion or the scriptures is important?
Yes and no. Pedagogically, what I like to tell my colleagues, when I talk to them about teaching and learning, is that the more years of experience I have as a teacher, the less I lecture and the less I say, and the more I like to listen. Our undergrads are required to take 9 credits in theology and religious studies, no matter what their major, no matter what school or program they're in at the university. So that if they're in the Tobin College of Business, they have to take 3 theologies. If they're in the College of Pharmacy, they have to take 3 theologies. If they're in the School of Education, they have to take 3 theologies. Doesn't matter. And it's relatively rare that they come into their first theology course really excited about the subject. But what they often discover, and what my hope and my prayer is that they discover, is that theology classes are not places where they're going to be preached to, but that theology classes are spaces where it's possible to ask the hard question, the why question, that may not be a legitimate question in organic chemistry or in accounting or in ROTC. The question of not only what am I going to do, but who am I, and what is the meaning of my existence? Why am I in this world? And so on and so on. So I find myself open to those questions, more open to those questions as time goes on, and the ways in which the current pandemic has put that question front and center on the lips of students is certainly something that I anticipate wrestling with them about as the semester is about to begin. It was certainly a set of questions that was front and center on their minds during the spring semester.
Well, I'm grateful for the teaching you're doing, grateful for your work in the field of biblical studies, but mostly grateful that you spent some time with me and, by extension, the people of Westminster Presbyterian.
I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and to share some of my questions with you and with the people of Westminster Presbyterian.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and stay healthy. And one of these days, we'll see each other in real life again, I would hope.
I hope so too.